Look out for a rather large offer. 6 months in...
Tail tested on your dog.
In the 5th century, St. Michael was said to have appeared before fishermen here, and for nearly 1,000 years this great rocky outcrop off the Cornish coast, topped by the massive granite stones of the summit fortress, became an important place of pilgrimage. For centuries too, this was an island of great strategic and military significance. It was here a beacon was lit in 1587 to warn of the approach of the Spanish Armada come to invade England. But the heart of the mount remains the tiny church which sits on the highest point of the island. The original church was built in 1135 by the Benedictine monks of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy and rebuilt in the 14th century. For hundreds of years this was the destination for thousands of pilgrims from all over England. In the Middle Ages, the main highway through Cornwall led directly to St. Michael's Mount. Light comes largely from two beautiful 15th century rose windows in the east and west ends. Behind one of the pews there's a secret passage that was discovered during renovation work in the early part of this century. In the dungeon below, the skeleton of a man over 7 foot high was discovered. No one knows who he was or why he was imprisoned here. At high tide, the only way to get to the mount is by boat. And you land on the very same spot where the young Queen Victoria came ashore from the royal yacht when she visited here in 1846. The mount has always held a fascination for outsiders, despite the fact that for centuries it's also been a private house, the home of the St. Aubyn family since the 17th century. By necessity, the rooms are very small. These are the Blue Drawing Rooms, converted from a ruined chapel in 1740. The fine early Rococo plasterwork dates from the reign of George II, and the furniture is Chippendale. And everywhere there are portraits. This is Dolly Pentreath of Mousel, the last recorded person to speak only the Cornish language, who died in 1777 at the age of 102. In Sir John's room, Sir John St. Aubyn himself, the 5th Baronet, beside Lady St. Aubyn, who lived here at the turn of the 19th century, when, as today, the Mount would often have been a rather uncomfortable place to live.
Well, of course, it's very different living here in the winter because we're very much subject to storms. And when there's a rail gale, it can last for 4 or 5 days. That means it's practically impossible to get ashore, possibly for an hour every day. And the children of the island can't get to school. And living up here, it's terribly exciting. You know, it's a very strong wind, it's very noisy. And we're entirely cut off from the mainland. There's no way we could get help from the mainland if anything happened to us.
This is the original monk's refectory, still used by the family, with its magnificent 17th century oak table. Over the hearth, the royal coat of arms dating from 1660. It celebrates the restoration of the monarchy. Charles II had stayed here whilst en route to exile after the Civil War. Opposite, the arms of the St. Aubyn family granted by the King for services to the crown. Between them, a portrait of the Devonshire squire George Monk, who played a large role in the negotiations which had led to Charles's return. With a little help from modern technology, the church bells still ring out for services on the mount, which have to be timed like everything else here according to the tide. With the causeway exposed at low water, churchgoers mix with the National Trust visitors who come in their hundreds, just as pilgrims have done for nearly 1,000 years. There's a certain urgency to sightseeing here. They know they'll only have a few hours before the tide returns. Below the great parapet, a terraced rock garden that amazingly manages to thrive despite being constantly lashed by the salt water and winds of the famous Cornish gales. Here native wildflowers mix with rare tropical and subtropical plants and shrubs. And when the tide returns, there's the St. Alban family barge on hand. This boat, recently restored, is over 200 years old. The oldest boat of its kind still afloat. The oarsman doing the job that the traditional monk boatman in the family livery carried out for centuries. And of course it's at high tide that St. Michael's Mount is once again sealed off from the outside world. Somehow serene, noble, and majestic, as if almost from another world. In 1741, the young heir to a banking fortune, Henry Hall II, returned from his grand tour of Europe and set about transforming the grounds of his new inheritance in Wiltshire into the finest landscape gardens in England. For over 40 years he worked tirelessly at the task and produced what was then and still is today a brilliant creation. Tower Head is set on a ridge of the Wiltshire Downs. The main block of the house was already standing when the young Henry returned from his travels. It had been built 20 years before by his father and was one of the first Palladian houses in England, a prototype for many similar 18th century country houses up and down the country. As he had already started to do in the garden, Henry Hall set about furnishing the new house with large numbers of objets d'art from his travels around Europe. Towering above the Chippendale breakfast table stands the monumental Pope's Cabinet, reputed to have belonged to Pope Sixtus V, who died in 1590, and which was acquired by Henry in Rome. When this extraordinary object arrived at Stourhead in 1742, Henry had it mounted on a mahogany plinth, with a suitable acknowledgement to its previous owner. It's a superb example of the Florentine technique of marquetry, using gilt marble and semi-precious stones. In the 1790s, Henry's grandson, Sir Richard Colt Hoare, added 2 flanking pavilions to the house, one of them housing the picture gallery. It's an appropriate setting for the vast canvases which dominate even this huge room. The largest of them, the Tigoli masterpiece, the Adoration of the Magi, commissioned in 1605 for the Albizzi Chapel in Florence and acquired by Colt Hoare nearly 200 years later. The frame, topped by the gilded ram's face, the work of Thomas Chippendale the Younger, whose influence on Stourhead in the early 19th century was to prove extremely significant. On the south side of the house, Colt Hoare built the library, a beautiful room that's probably the finest surviving Regency room of its type in the country. In the library, as in many other rooms of the house, Colt Hoare asked Thomas Chippendale to design and build the furnishings. This is his massive writing table. Although not as great a public figure as his father, Thomas Chippendale's work here has seldom been surpassed. mahogany glowing with light. This was a style that became fashionable after Bonaparte's Egyptian campaign of 1797, and was probably picked up by Chippendale on a visit to Paris in 1803. In all, the effect of furniture like this, precisely placed in such a superb setting, is exactly what Colt Hoard intended. A perfect room for study and contemplation. This is indeed what it was used for, especially by close friends of the family for many years afterwards. Even here, though, it's impossible to escape the influence of the great landscape garden on which Henry Hoare had set to work in 1741. The garden is designed to be seen from above, approached by a shady path which winds its way down the steep-sided coombe to the west. The descent is punctuated by sudden and tantalizing views of the delights that lie ahead. Tower Head was Hoare's reaction to the traditional formal gardens he'd seen at Versailles and elsewhere. A romantic Arcadian paradise with echoes of the elegance of ancient Greece and Rome. The Bristol High Cross, for all the world like the spire of a buried church, was brought from Bristol to Towerhead in 1765. The mass of rhododendrons and azaleas arrived with the fashion at the turn of the century. Hoare created his lake by damming the River Stour just where several medieval fish ponds had been. The estate village was moved to the edge of the valley, so it couldn't be seen. And he even added a grotto, a white-painted lead river god pointing the way up to the Pantheon. Next to him, Ariadne lies asleep beside the chilly waters of the Stour. And even from the grotto, as everywhere else in the